So, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you and to have you here. So I see Lúcia, Ibanca, and Alexandre. So we are good to go. So for each paper, we have half an hour. So I propose that you speak for up to 20 minutes and leave 10 minutes for general discussions. There's the chat function that I invite everyone who wants to ask questions to use that function, so it's easier to keep the questions registered somehow. So we will start with Lúcia, and she will present the paper Teaching General Equilibrium Theory in the Early 20th Century, an analysis of treatises. So Lúcia, thank you. And the show is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Sharing my screen. Yes. So hello, everyone. My name is Lúcia. I am a PhD student at University of São Paulo. This paper is part of my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, in which I studied the dissemination of Wagnerian ideas at the beginning of the 20th century. So in this particular chapter, I studied the dissemination of Bauhaus thought in one particular dimension, that is the classroom. So I chose to study three different textbooks that presented Bauhaus model, Bowley's one, Castle, and Antonelli, and more than contributing with the literature on Bauhaus thought and the general equilibrium theory history, I also wanted to contribute with this particular chapter, this particular paper, with the literature on textbooks, and more particular with the literature on textbooks in the pre-war period, that is still a less exploited period, a period less study, I think. So the first important point to be made is that these books, they presented an important feature of textbooks of that time, because they were meant to be used by students, but they also had some original contributions. So this is why usually they were referred by general treatises, and this is why the title of my paper is an analysis of treatises and not an analysis of textbooks. But I do show in my paper that the authors, they made it very explicitly that they were writing for students. And the second point is why I chose these books, these three particular books. First, Castle and Bowley, they appear in the secondary literature as the ones that popularized and Bauhaus model. Schumpeter, for example, said that Marshall's teaching in England excluded any contender until Bowley presented Bauhaus Pareto model in his 1924 textbooks, and Wicksell, for example, discussing one of his works, Castle popularization, and he used this term, popularization of the Wagnerian system. So some important and known authors, like as I mentioned, Schumpeter and Wicksell, they argue that Castle and Bowley's book were really important in training generations, learning Bauhaus model. So it's kind of clear why I chose Bowley and Castle, but the third book, Antonelli, he was a less known author, but he was probably very likely the first person to teach a mathematical economics course in France. And the book that he published was actually prepared by Volhas himself. Volhas, by the end of his life, he was very sick, but he still tried to adapt his book, his work in general, in a way that it could be used for teaching. And I showed this in my other chapters. He tried very hard first to get it translated to English, so he could be used in the United States. And he wanted that one young friend, Auberto Petit, use this version to start teaching mathematical economics courses in France, but Petit, he never used it. He ended up leaving the academy to work in the Bank of France. So Antonelli was the one that took this version of Volhas' ideas meant to be used in the classroom, and he published in France in 1914. So I wanted to study the dissemination of Volhas' ideas in the classroom, and I chose these 3 books, and I hope I made it clear why I chose the books. And the next step was then to choose how to study these general treatises, how I was going to analyze them, which approach to use. And at the time I was writing this chapter, I was also studying a book about how to use quantitative text analysis for English students using R. And I think the book tried to study the novel Moby Dick. And so I was like, what if I use something like that to analyze my books too? So I tried, but I didn't want to do anything too eccentric. So I analyzed the most employed words in each text, and I think it helped me to summarize and see visually some of the difference between the books. For example, one of the most used words in Castle's book was production, and he actually spent a lot of more time than the other books to discuss particularly the production problem. And Antonelli, he used a lot the word school. And this was very interesting. I call it in French because he was French.
Just a second. I think Steve and Maxime, you have the mics open. So thank you. Go ahead, Lucia.
So one of the words that Antonelli used the most was school. And this for me was interesting because he was French. He was trying to present something that that was very new. So he couldn't present knowledge as something to students, as something consensual, because he was actually trying to challenge the status quo. So he spent a lot of time in his book presenting schools of thought, presenting economic science as something that that wasn't consensual. And Bowley, he wrote a very difficult book, and trying to making it easier for the students, he added an appendix, a mathematical appendix. And actually the word appendix was one of the most used words in the book. So I could see that he had to refer to this appendix a lot of times. So if you're a student and you're trying to read Bowley's book, you probably would have to go to the appendix numerous times to actually understand what he was presenting. So this was the first thing I did, the quantitative text analysis. But I couldn't write a full paper seeing only the most used words or trying to visualize them. So I used this analysis and an introduction. And the second part of the paper, I use a content analysis technique that is actually a very established methodology in the textbook literature. Several papers that study textbooks did a content analysis technique. This is a table. It's table 4 of my paper, my chapter, and presents the content comparison of each of the chapters of the 3 books. So I highlight.
Just a second. We don't see anything in the screen. Are you showing some visual?
Yes.
So you can
what now?
Try to stop sharing and share again, because it's frozen in the methodology part.
Now you can see?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So I highlighted with similar colors a chapter with similar content, and the ones that are with no color are those that do not have correspondence in the other books. We see that Antonelli at chapter 1 is the only one to present a chapter on Valha's life, presenting the story of Valha's life and Valha's work, that doesn't have any comparable in the other 2 works. Kessel's book is the only one to present a chapter on international payments, and a significant part of the books is dedicated to this whole white part is dedicated to analysis of economic cycles, and Bowley's book was the only one to analyze monopolies and taxations. In the part in red, that it's kind of dark pink maybe, they were the general equilibrium theory equations presented. So while this subject, general equilibrium theory, is the last one to be presented in Antonelli's and one of the last discussed in Bowley's book, Kessel presented the general equilibrium equations before most of his chapters. I also analyzed how the 3 books presented the definition of economic science and its scope. Bowley, he said that economic science was supposed to deal with 2 things, material goods and material goods and immaterial services. And he pointed it out that the subject had 2 aspects. One aspect was the subjective one, moral, psychological, and the other one was the objective or material side. And mathematics could be used to analyze the second aspect, the material aspect. But it was still possible also to study the subjective aspects by identifying equalities, continuities, and other properties. So the second part was could be considered for him as a measurable shadow of an unidentified object. And Kessel, he had a narrow view about the scope of economic science. For him, the ultimate aim of economics was to discover those necessities which were of a purely economic nature and could not be mastered by the will of man. For example, the quantitative demanded of a product at a given price was the object of study of economic science, but the psychological process behind this do not belong to the domain of economic theory. Antonelli, he also believed that exchanges were social facts as opposed to individual psychological facts. So these were some of the content analysis conclusions. And I will skip to the last part. So I said in the first part the most used words, and then I turned it to a more established methodology in the second part, the content analysis. And the third part of the chapter, I tried to come back to words. And I study rhetorics, or as McCloskey stated, wordcraft. So I tried to identify the rhetorical resources employed by the authors to show the students that the approach they were presenting was a good approach, that their ideas were good ideas. And I will only mention here the most evident of the rhetorical and the literary arguments, the appeal to authority. Bowley states that his work was based on the ideas of established authors in economic science, for example, Cournot, Jevons, Edgeworth. Yes, he doesn't mention Bauhaus, although he was presenting his model. Antonelli, in his turn, he relied on the authority of Bauhaus, that was later recognized at the beginning of the 20th century in France. And his choice is then to show that there were disagreements on how to do economic science. Remember that he presented different views of different schools of thought. So he actually undermines the appeal to authority of the mainstream schools, showing students that the mainstream were not the only options, that their authority was not incontestable. And Castle, he was very peculiar. He actually presented himself as someone breaking with the past. He accused other treatises of being too scholastic, and he wanted to do away with the whole of the old theory of value. So for me, his choice was actually to demonstrate the originality and uniqueness of his work, and something that the students couldn't find anywhere else. So the conclusions, first, it's really a work in progress. I'm still thinking what to do with which of the sections, which if I should keep it or not. But my main conclusion is that with respect to the dissemination of the Valrasian general equilibrium theory, although the three books presented Bauhaus framework, they also present at the same time antagonistic fundamental beliefs about what was economic science and its scope, and therefore Bauhaus' model was taught in very different theoretical frameworks. There was not a dominant group that appropriated. In spite of that, the content analysis technique shows that the three treatises shared some similarities in their structure, which already indicate some degree of standardization in the first decades of the 20th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lúcia. Thank you for being right on time. And so we have some 10 minutes for general discussion. I would propose that anyone who wants to ask questions or make a comment, just raise your hand through the Zoom option here, and then we open the mic and speak to make it more humane. So we have time to discuss if someone wants to join. Yes, Maxime, and then Steve.
Thank you, Lucia. That looks very interesting. Just a quick question. Do you know to what extent the structure of Cassell's book is different in English from the original in German?
Should I answer now, or should I answer after?
Yeah, we can make a conversation.
Yeah, I have no idea because I can read German. you already know I spent a lot of time trying to learn French in my from my dissertation. So maybe one day, but I can't read German, and I am really afraid of trying to make some conclusions about a language that I really don't know.
But if I may, you don't need to do the sort of semantic analysis and the word count and all this quantitative part in a way, but at least to compare the books, and maybe there's actually, you can see in the literature people who've commented on Cassell that would answer your question. Maybe it's a literal translation and that's sort of just, a footnote you can deal with, or maybe there are big difference, and then it's another question whether you want to study these difference or not. But at least you have to know, because I know the original German was, probably more read than even the English version, right? So in the dispersion of knowledge, that mattered a lot at the time.
Yes, yes. I think at least I could like compare the chapters, because Antonelli I did compare in French because there was not the original, so maybe the content analysis technique I could do it in German. Maybe see if there were differences.
Just probably the first step would be just the table of content. You can just get the translation of the table of content from the German, just to see if the overall structure of the book is similar. But Steve, and then Ibanca.
Yeah, thanks. Apologies for the mic switching on. I'm waiting for a construction contractor and wrestling dogs over here. The phone was in my pocket and off it went. And the contractor's here, so I'll be quick. I'm wondering, Lucia, to what extent these texts contrasted a general equilibrium view versus Marshallian partial equilibrium type view, and the sort of virtues and vices or pluses and minuses of each one, or was it just a general equilibrium approach that was adopted as sort of the best normal science without any attention to partial equilibrium approaches?
Yeah, so Bowley, he didn't mention Marshall as one of the authors that he was trying to present the ideas, but he actually only presented his book was very short. It's 90 pages or something like that. So he actually presented only the general equilibrium model, though he did he told that he was using Marshalls, but the other two I don't know. Antonelli for sure, he only presented Bauha's model because it was the book that Bauha's wrote with some alterations. Yeah, that was it.
Thank you, Lucia. Ibanca?
Lucia, for sharing your work. This was very fascinating. I have two reactions. One is I'd be really curious to see you do systematic comparison in terms of reception of the textbooks and not just the content of them. Which one was more popular, in what context, what was maybe the critiques of some of them. So I'd love to see that be part of your research as well. I know you spoke on it a bit. And secondly, I was very curious by Antonelli's chapter, the first chapter being sort of this biographical sketch. Would love to know more about the tone of that. Was it very laudatory? what sorts of details were in that chapter. Thanks.
Thank you, Ibanca. I really like your paper too. I already read it twice to the winter seminar to the HS conference. Well, so yeah, Antonelli, and I showed this in the other chapters, he declared himself like a follower of Bauhaus, and he actually had a lot of problems because of that. He was denied to be a full professor in France because of that. So yes, the chapter was a very it was like presenting Bauhaus as this hero that was not very it wasn't understood and ahead of his time.
Any other comment or question? No. So I think we should move to the second paper, and at the end, if anyone wants to come back to ask Lúcia any question or make a comment, feel free at the end. So we go to the second paper by Alexandre Truc, the Disciplinary Mobility of Core Behavioral Economists. So thank you so much, Alexandre. The show is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about the disciplinary mobility of behavioral economists. So interdisciplinarity in behavioral economics is an important topic. For example, there was often a long discussion about whether it's just rhetorical or if there is really interdisciplinary exchanges between economics and psychology. And often the discussion focuses on the objects circulating, such as theories or methods. And what I wanted to do in this paper is to focus instead of on disciplinary mobility, which is a particular form of interdisciplinarity that has been neglected in such a study. So disciplinary mobility, simply put, is simply when a researcher from one discipline publish outside of his discipline. So psychologists in economics, economists in psychology. And this disciplinary mobility, we know it's important in the history of behavioral economics because the field was founded most notably by Kahneman and Tversky, who are two psychologists who published a lot in economics. And so it is often argued that this movement from psychology to economics played an important role in the shaping of behavioral economics. It is also something particularly notable that this disciplinary mobility happens because we know that there are important cognitive and institutional barriers to disciplinary mobility. So for an economist, it is difficult to publish in another discipline. And more generally, we are not encouraged to switch discipline because it's harder to get promotion or this kind of thing, for example. So as historian, we should pay attention when this happens because it can maybe tell us something about what's happening in economics. So to achieve this goal of studying disciplinary mobility in behavioral economics, I wanted to investigate the role that it plays in the history and in the history of the field, and identify forms and direction of mobility that we find. And to do that, I wanted to study the publication of a handful of behavioral economists, which I'm going to talk about just after, with quantitative indicators. So not only to look at where they publish, but also to look at how their citation behavior, for example, or the constitution of their research program evolve as they develop disciplinary mobility. So the first I look at the first generation of behavioral economics, so which is Kahneman, Tversky, and Thaler, so the three founders of the field. In the 1970s, before there was really a behavioral economics program, the interaction between economics and psychologists was mostly informal and at a very local level. So, for example, at Michigan. Kahneman and Tversky regularly gathered economists and psychologists in workshops, but it was mostly at this level that there was interaction between the two disciplines. In 1979, Kahneman and Tversky published their first article in economics with prospect theory. So the article that is now very famous and very influential. But it was their first article in economics, and it was very hard for them to get it published. So as I said, there are important barriers to publish in other disciplines. So out of the 5 years that it took them to publish the paper, 4 were dedicated to tweaking the paper to fit an economic audience. So one big issue was really about getting the idea of prospect theory in a way that would be accepted by economists. Even after publishing this first paper, Kahneman and Tversky did not publish in economics before 1986. So even in the early 80s and after this publication, Kahneman and Tversky were not very confident in their ability to continue publishing in economics, because most notably because of the kind of modeling techniques that economists use, that Kahneman was not familiar with, and that was not the kind of mathematics that even mathematical psychologists were necessarily using. One thing that changed this position is that between 1984 and 1992, Kahneman and Tversky found, and more generally the behavioral economics program, found an anchor with the help of the Sloan's Foundation and the Russell Sage Foundation. So we are going to focus most notably on this period of 84 and 92. If we look at Kahneman and Tversky publication, so we can see that before 1984, they mostly published in psychology. So something we expect, they are psychologists. So the vast majority of the paper, more than 80%, are in psychology. But after 1984, we find an important movement and an important mobility for them from psychology to economists. And especially in the case of Kahneman, between 1984 and 1991, most of his papers, so 72%, so the majority of his papers, were published in economics journals. So really, he went from being mostly a psychologist to being mostly an economist. So we can see that the Sloan Sage period played an important role. But even after the Sloan Sage, so once he had learned how to publish in economics, how to address an economics audience and develop a research program that was well integrated in economics, he continued to be a disciplinary scholar throughout his life, and had on average like almost half of his publication in economics and half of his publication in other disciplines. At the opposite, if we look at Thaler, who is an economist by formation, we find that Thaler never went from economics to psychology. So the mobility really went one direction, with these two psychologists going in economics. So the Sloan Sage Foundation play an important role in different manners. So the first, for example, there was an important there were important discussions about how to convince economics to listen to psychological argument, but more generally to accept some criticism. So there was the idea of developing a non-confrontational rhetoric. So to not basically to not be like Herbert Simon and to not criticize economics too much. There was a balance, careful care in balancing disciplines. So, for example, within the board, there was always half psychologist and half economist. And when one was leaving, he was replaced by someone of the same discipline. So, behavioral economics within the program had access to important people from both disciplines. And finally, the Sloan Sage Foundation also stimulated a lot of collaboration, and most notably between Kahneman and Thaler, because a lot of the paper that Kahneman published in the early, in the mid-80s, were with Thaler. So in a lot of ways, Thaler was the one opening the door to Kahneman by helping him writing more market-oriented paper, more economics-oriented paper. So as I said, mobility is one thing, but for example, an economist can publish in a sociological journals, but not be interdisciplinary. It could be imperialism, or for example, a physicist could leave physics and come to economics and simply switch fields. This is something we can see, for example, in philosophy of economics, where economists left economics to become philosophers. But in that case, it's migration and not really the same kind of disciplinary mobility that when you build a research program at the frontiers of multiple disciplines. So the second thing that we did is to look at how this behavior economists cite economics, whether it is published in economic journals or not. So first, let's look at Thaler. I'm not going to talk about Dispersky because he died prematurely, but let's look at Thaler. So as we said, Thaler published mostly in economics. And when he published in economics, so the red curve, he cites mostly economics. So something we kind of expect, but not necessarily, but it means that Thaler really focused on economics topic. And even in his publication in economics, he did not have to import a lot of references from other disciplines to make his point and develop his framework. And this stayed the same throughout his life. If we look at Kahneman, we see a very different pattern. So in the early years, when publishing in economics, he cites a lot of economics. And when publishing in psychology, he does not cite economics paper at all. But over time, in economics paper, he started to cite less and less economics. And in psychological paper, he started to cite more and more economics. So the two curves are converging, which is more generally the idea that Kahneman developed a research program, the same research program in both disciplines, and what he published in economics and in psychology nourished each other. Another way to visualize this idea, which is more general, is that, for example, if we look at the bibliographic coupling network of Kahneman's publication, simply put, I'm just going to focus on visual here. If we look at the publication between 1983 and 1992, we can see that it forms a coherent research program, but the green node, which are the green publication, which are in economics, are very separated from the pink publication, which are in psychology. So it's easy to find a line that would split green node from a pink node. So basically, it's almost two different research programs. But in the 90s, it's almost impossible to find a line that separates a green node from pink node and more generally from other nodes. So the idea is that the research program of Kahneman becomes harder to differentiate in function of the discipline in which it is published. So he is working on different topics, but these topics are working on, he work on this topic in different disciplines, in different journals. So, okay, I can talk about more about the methodology after, but let's move on to the second and third generation. So this is the beginning. So Kahneman, Tversky, and Thaler are the founder, but then there is a second generation that come, which are mostly economists, because the behavioral economics program remain a economics centered program. And what happened to this second generation? If we look at their publication, once again, we find that some of them, like Fair, Rabin, Kammerer, or Leibson, published mostly in economics at the beginning of their academic life. Especially in the case of Fair, Rabin, and Leibson, the first 15 years of their academic life, they published only in economics journals. So they are really economists. But after the 2000, they also start to publish in other disciplines, so most notably in general science journals like Science, Nature, in neuroscience journals, and in psychology journals. To the point that, for example, for Fair, economics publication represented less than half of his publication in the mid-2010. Similarly for Kammerer and for Leibson, after the 2010, we find also that his publication in economics became the minor part of his publication. So we also find disciplinary mobility, but this time the disciplinary mobility is away from economics. So it's economists publishing in other disciplines. So we have this mobile economists, but we also find immobile economists. So like Rabin. Rabin was published in economics at the beginning of his career and published in only in economics at the end of his career. So it's really an economics centered approach. So on the one hand, we find that some economists like Rabin follow Thaler's path. The idea is to develop behavioral economics in a direction that is mostly about satisfying economics, what economics want from behavioral economics. So one of the reason it does that is simply to be strategic. For example, he explained that he wants to focus on core journals because if he were to publish in non-core journals, it will be harder for him to be taken seriously by economists. More generally, even beyond strategical consideration, Rabin has been a defender of what he called portable extension of existing models. So basically, it's really about extending existing economic model that respect all the desiderata of economic models, so parsimony, predictiveness, generality, and so on and so forth. So it's really about using psychology, but to satisfy all what economists can expect from economic theory. And even more generally, Rabin has been explicitly talking about this topic and arguing for a return to normal science, which involve focusing back on economics and in some way stop importing, basically he argued that economics does not need more interdisciplinary importation, but know that what we need is to take all the knowledge that we have now in behavioral economics to find a new way to unify this in economics, to find a general model. So we have the follow the Thaler's way, so focus on economics, but we also find that others have followed the Kahneman's path. So in a way, it's the idea that you take behavioral economics as a research program that is at the frontiers of multiple disciplines, which involve some form of mobility. It is, for example, explicitly stated by Gintis, who say it like this: we are more generally behavioral scientists. Our results do not belong to economics. So basically, behavioral economics is a behavioral science program and not just an economics research program. In the case of Kammerer, for example, this interaction should lead to more radical approaches, for example, which involve turning back the end of time and asking how economics might have been if it had been informed from the start by cognitive sciences. So basically, rethink the whole framework of macroeconomics, given what we know now from behavioral science. So once again, if we look at how this mobility impacted their citation patterns to economics, we also find very different patterns from Kahneman and Thaler. In the case of Rabin, we find that in the early years, while he published mostly in economics, he also cited a lot of other disciplines. But over time, he just cited more and more economics. So it's really coherent with the position he's defending. So basically, we should return to normal science, return to economics. But we also find a very different pattern from Kahneman from our other behavioral economics, because what we find is, first, there is a big gap between the share of citation to economics, whether they published in economics or not. So it means that they don't rely on the same kind of knowledge when they publish outside of economics. And more importantly, we find that some of them cite less and less economics, even in economics and outside of economics. And even in the case of Fair, we find that he cites almost no economics after the 2010. So basically, they rely less and less on economics knowledge. So it kind of looks like they are partly migrating away from economics. So they publish less in economics. They cite less economics, whether it's in economics or not. And what we observe is that some of them rely on a new source of legitimacy. that are away from the top 5 economic journals, most notably by publishing in Nature, Science, +1. So top generalist journals, but generalist science journals, which are not necessarily often, which are not a place where economists often publish. And they do that most often to follow more radical research programs, so neuroeconomics, genoeconomics, so stuff that are further away from economists' core concern and more generally what economists are interested in about. They incorporate non-behavioral data, which even in bioeconomics is not very standard. And they have an interest into the evolutionary and anthropological origin of preferences, which economists really rarely discuss. So to conclude, we find that the initial mobility of Kahneman and Tversky from psychology to economics stimulated more mobility from some member of this second generation that were also in the Sloan Foundation. So it was not only about imitating Kahneman and Tversky in the way they model or in the way they did experiments. It's also imitating in the way they practice science and in the way they practice bioeconomics as a program at the frontiers of multiple disciplines. At the opposite, Thaler, like Rybin, really adopted the role of promoter or importer. So they focused on economics, and what is important to them was fitting the knowledge from other disciplines to economics. At the opposite, so at the opposite of Rabin, Kammerer, Leibson, and Fair, for example, push the frontier of economics further by moving away from the discipline. But it's also a risk for them to become less relevant to economists, because as the frontier, as they push the frontier further by their own practice, and as they argue themselves to be more generally behavioral economists and not only economists, they might be deemed by economists to simply have stopped doing economics and to have become behavioral science. So with the risk of having themselves be excluded from economics. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. So questions and comments for him. Again, you can raise your hand through the Zoom option and then open the mic. Maxime?
Thanks, Alexandre. This is really interesting work. I just ticked on one thing you said at the very end when you said because they cite less and less, or at least some of your guys cite less and less economic papers, you said they rely less on economic knowledge. And to me, this wasn't obvious statement. It might also be that some of these economic ideas and concepts that they imported in psychology in a way are so common knowledge now in this literature that they don't need to cite economic papers. You know, I don't know if they talk about a utility function in the 70s in psychology journal, they would have had to cite economists, but maybe in the 2000s they can talk about utility function without citing anyone, and that doesn't mean they rely less on economic knowledge.
Yes. Yes, thank you for the question. Well, one of the thing is really, well, yeah, it's true when I look only at citation, but more generally, I also look at bibliographic, at their bibliography, like when I talk about Kahneman and Tversky, and what we find is that more generally, when they published outside of economics, it's increasingly different from when they published in economics. So even beyond the idea that they cite less economics, it's also that more generally their publication outside of economics rely on a different kind of knowledge than their publication in economics. And this kind of knowledge is less econ-centered than the one they published in economics. For example, this is really visible with the case of Leibson. If you look, his publications are almost not related to the rest of the network. So it's almost like only connected to what he does in economics by a thread. and I have a more general indicators to like measure this kind of thing. And so you can see that, I mean, it's complicated to explain simply, but yes, but more generally, visually, it's just this idea that what they do outside of economics is not part of a coherent research program like the migration of Kahneman is. And on that point, the case of Lowenstein is what I use in the paper to show what it look like if you really, in the end, if you talk about the same thing when you are publishing in and out of economics, because it's like a mixed bag of colors instead of like clearly separated.
Okay, Maxime, are you okay? That okay. So Aurélien.
Yes, thank you, Alexandre, for your presentation. I have a kind of methodological question. In your graph with the proportion of paper published in economics and other disciplines, you are mixing economics and management together, whereas they are separated in Web of Science. So I just wanted to know why you were doing that, and if you have checked if it was not hiding over trends. And so, well, did you do that because you dislike the Web of Science categorization and you think that many journals classified as management are actually economics, or what?
Yes, so one of the issue with the management is that it's very heterogeneous category, but actually it's an arbitration in the case of this paper because well, they simply do not publish a lot in management, with the exception of Thaler, who publishes in finance. So really, Thaler is the one that has a lot of paper in management, and I mean, it's not a big stretch to say that when Thaler publishes in finance, it's kind of very related to economics. So this is the main reason, but yeah. In the appendix, I had separated also generalist science journals and neuroscience, and maybe I should also separate economics and management to show that, well, it's just an arbitrage that I made because like management is not really relevant in this case, just simply because like it does not really influence the result a lot. But thank you.
Thank you. Ibanca, please.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I was very impressed by the quantitative and the bibliographic analysis, so well done. I was very intrigued by the involvement of the private foundations, the Sloan and the Russell Sage Foundation, and I'm curious if their engagement was beyond just providing funding and getting these scholars to work together, like were they also hosting conferences and workshops that brought these people together in person? Were they affecting the agenda of the research in a very substantive way? So yeah, I'm very curious about that part of this history.
Thank you. So yes, the foundation the two foundations help the development of the behavioral economics research program. It was they helped in a lot of ways. So there was some PhD and postdoc position that were financed by these funds. They edited a series of books about some of the first handbook in behavioral economics. They organized workshops and conferences. It was not a lot of money when you compare. I mean, if you think about behavioral economics, which is a big thing, the amount, I don't remember the amount precisely, but it was not like very big amount, especially if you compare to what to the kind of amount that behavioral economists get. So, for example, Ernst Fair get a lot more money now that the Sloan Sage Foundation ever give to behavioral economics. But it helped them organize. And one of the arguments of a column is that mostly it was really a way to bring all of these people together and like to centralize all the people interested in discussion in one place. And he used the expression "give a sense of mission." Yeah, so indeed there was a program operator that was working for the Sloan Sage Foundation and helped steer the program. I mean, the main point of the program was really to help behavioral science enter economics. but no, I don't have a lot of information if whether more generally the private part of the Sloan Sage was, I mean, what was the involvement of like the private actors from the Sloan Sage. And I know there was a board, and the board was mostly composed of academics beside the program officer, which were involved, but yeah, but I mean, the main idea was to really get behavioral science and economics, but beside that, I'm not sure.
Okay, any other question or comment? No, so again, we can go back to this discussion at the end if we have time. So I think it's better for us to move to the third presentation by Ibanca. So secondhand dealing in economics ideas, a study of the foundation for economic education, 1946-1960. Thank you, Ibanca. It's your turn.
Great, thanks, Pedro. Thank you everyone for joining our panel this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are zooming in from. My name is Ibanca Anand, and I am a first-year PhD student in the history department at Johns Hopkins University. Let me share my screen. I did have some technical difficulties this morning, so please let me know if this is working. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, when I move it, can you see the next slide? Okay,
yes,
great.
It's working.
Great. So this is material from my master's thesis, which was completed last year at the London School of Economics in the Economic History Department. So while it is complete, it remains a topic that I'm still interested in exploring further. So any feedback that you have would be much appreciated. A few of you have seen some of this material already, as Lúcia mentioned. It's a little bit modified, so hopefully there's new stuff in here for you. Okay, before I get started on talking about FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, I would like to first motivate the question. So in a 2018 presidential address to the History of Economic Society, then President Evelyn Forget made the following assessment of our discipline. Much of our work is motivated by a theory of knowledge creation that is much too simple. We focus far too much on those we identify as creators of economic knowledge and far too little on the other characters in the story. A marginalized character that Forget places emphasis on in her address and throughout her own research is an agent of change she calls the knowledge broker. This agent is situated between multiple actors, including economists, other academic experts, policymakers, financiers, and consumers, these being dynamic, interconnected categories themselves. Knowledge brokers act as intermediaries between different social groups, building channels of communication through processes like translation, mediation, and popularization. Their tasks are far from mechanical, Forget stresses, urging us to dig deeper on the cognitive, political, and social dimensions of what it means to broker knowledge. What I find especially compelling about Forget's framework is that it diverges from a traditional intellectual treatment of science communication. So there's a dominant view of popularization, which views translation efforts as attempts to water down expert discourses for consumption by non-expert audiences. This framework maintains a hierarchy of knowledge and leaves no space for contention or voice. So there's been a postmodern turn in the history, sociology, and philosophy of science and neighboring disciplines, which has caused a shift from the dominant view to a more participatory and co-creational model, where everyday citizens are considered as essential partners in scientific enterprise. The shift has been institutionalized in emergent disciplines like the sociology of scientific knowledge and science and technology studies. And I argue that these conceptual approaches to popularization have a unique significance for the social sciences, though they have been primarily applied to the natural sciences. So Mary Morgan has explained that social scientists do not have exclusive domain over ideas about social and economic affairs. Everyday citizens who live in the worlds that social scientists study and whose behaviors are implicated in the studies have their own observations and their own experiential knowledge. Thus, the idea of popularization as a linear communication process becomes doubly flawed for economic knowledge, where communicators are mediating boundaries between different agents that can all claim to have some form of expertise. So an influential framework has been offered by Jim Secord, his knowledge and transit framework, and he says that questions of what is being said can only be answered through a simultaneous understanding of how, where, when, and for whom. I find this knowledge and transit understanding especially relevant to a literature that several of us are well familiar with, which is the history of neoliberalism. So there exists a rich and rapidly growing literature on the shift toward a pro-market neoliberal order in American politics and society, and indeed globally. So just to give a bit of historiographical context, some scholars have explored developments within mainstream economics and its coalescence around a market-friendly neoclassical paradigm. Some have reflected on the relationship between social scientists and national defense objectives, especially within the Cold War context. And some have acknowledged the critical alliance of intellectual activists, such as businessmen and the media, in the explicit quest for ideational regime change. So an episode that is well known in the history of neoliberalism is the first meeting of the Mont Pellerian Society in 1947, convened by Friedrich Hayek. It was an exclusive invitation-only event in which the predominant attendees were economists, but there were also several other individuals which Hayek referred to as secondhand dealers in ideas, including journalists, businessmen, and think tank executives. So in the view of Hayek and his more learned peers, these individuals would serve as the disseminators of the principles formed by those more learned thinkers. And in my opinion, this treatment is reminiscent of the dominant view of popularization, which views knowledge as being created by a core group and then disseminated by others downward into society. And there is a tendency to reproduce this sort of treatment in the historiography. And so my contribution is to center those secondhand dealers in ideas and to uncover their activities, their motivations, and their own unique intellectual agency. And I focus on one specific individual, Leonard E. Reed, who has been mentioned in the history of neoliberalism literature, but often as a popularizer and a proselytizer of ideas, as opposed to someone creating ideas in his own right. So just a quick biographical sketch of Reed. He was born in 1898 in the rural town of Hubbardston, Michigan. He was raised by a working class family. His father passed away when Reed was 10 years old. And so he would work a variety of odd jobs in his childhood to support his family. He had to drop out of high school, or he elected to drop out of high school to serve in World War I as an aircraft mechanic in France. He had dreamed of becoming a surgeon, which he saw as a public servant lifestyle. So when he returned to Michigan, he attempted to save up for medical school by working at an ice cream company, a clothing company, an insurance collection agency. Ultimately was never able to return to school and continued in the path of sort of being this businessman. And in 1925, he moved with his wife to California in search of better opportunities. He became secretary of the nearly defunct Burlingame Chamber of Commerce, and that was his entry into the Chamber of Commerce universe, in which he spent 18 years, and he rose up the ranks to eventually become the general manager of the Los Angeles branch of the US Chamber of Commerce, which was then the largest metropolitan chamber in the country. During those 18 years, Reed also had a political awakening. So during a conversation with William C. Mullendore, who is a prominent lawyer, politician, and businessman, Reed was converted to the principles of economic freedom and undertook voracious reading in the subject. His lukewarm acceptance of New Deal programs, then a commonplace position within the Chamber of Commerce community, was replaced with bitter distaste. In 1937, Reed published his first book, The Romance of Reality, in which he critiqued the government's reform schemes, borrowing classical liberal ideas from Herbert Spencer, William Graham Sumner, and Albert J. Nock. The book was one of the first in a long string of libertarian activist efforts pursued by Fee, which included publishing Ayn Rand's Anthem before Rand rose to international acclaim in a publication he launched with his friends called The Pamphleteer. All of these efforts eventually paved the way to the founding of the Foundation for Economic Education. In 1946, a year before the renowned meeting in Mont, Pellerian, Reed obtained a loan from the conservative William Volcker Fund and established the Foundation for Economic Education in an affluent New York suburb, Irvington-on-Hudson. Within a year of its founding, Fee collected $254,000 in donations, roughly $3 million in today's terms. Initial financial support came from anti-New Deal corporations, including General Electric, General Motors, DuPont Chemicals, and BF Goodrich. Over time, however, Fee also amassed thousands of small individual contributions from teachers, students, and workers. Attendees at the 1946 Founders Meeting comprised of economists, businessmen, and journalists, and a look at Fee's trustees along the years suggests a similarly eclectic group of stewards. What held Fee's network together was not a shared vocational experience, but rather shared beliefs in liberty, anti-statism, and the need for coherent, accessible channels of communication for such ideas. Fee built these channels through a variety of efforts. They established an impressive print operation, which mass-produced libertarian classics, as well as published original editorial work by the organization's staff. By its 4-year anniversary, Fee had mailed out over 4 million pieces of literature free of cost to members on its mailing list, which had grown to over 30,000 subscribers. The mailing list expanded further in 1955 when Fee took over ownership of the Freeman, a preeminent free market magazine that had been launched in 1950 and had already accumulated a sizable readership. The number of Fee donors subsequently increased from 4,000 to 9,000 by 1956. An important aspect of Fee's publication strategy was that the rights to reprint any of their materials were unreserved. This meant that their work was often recirculated by magazines, house organs, and the Reader's Digest. One of Fee's primary contributions to the neoliberal movement was to put free market ideas into widespread material circulation. A further dimension of Fee's work was the creation of experiential learning opportunities. In 1947, they launched a college business exchange program that provided 6-week fellowships for academics, mostly economists, to undertake immersive experiences at host corporations, the purpose being to equip educators with a practical feel for the world of business. In the 24 years of the program, 1,600 researchers across 189 universities were placed at 102 participating firms. Another essential Fee program was targeted at students, providing them with preparatory materials to win high school and college debates. The intervention helped circulate free market logic at earlier stages of education when students were likely still developing their personal and political philosophies. Young adults were also exposed to Fee's work through seminars and lectures, which Fee associates were invited to give at high schools, colleges, athletic clubs, and other similar outlets. Indeed, speaking engagements were a core component of Fee's activities. Reed alone traveled approximately 70,000 miles annually delivering speeches at Lions and Rotary clubs, religious organizations, Chamber of Commerce events, and the like, sometimes to intimate audiences, which Reed preferred, and sometimes to rooms full of 1,000 attendees. Additionally, Fee hosted a number of lectures and seminars at their Irvington-on-Hudson site, which is right here in the bottom right corner. As one 1978 promotional video puts it, the scenic estate on the Hudson River provides an ideal setting for person-to-person interaction for those who are perhaps new to the freedom philosophy. Fee strove to create an environment that fostered curiosity and learning with an ethos that was relatively agnostic to the qualifications of its audiences. As Reed stated, Fee keeps open house for all those who are freedom-minded. It isn't for us to say who shall enter, our responsibility is to keep a good house. While assessing Fee's significance, it is crucial to keep in mind that free market libertarian ideas were not popular in the immediate post-war years. Fee functioned as a lighthouse in the 1950s for an out-of-favor ideological position. For those that were skeptical of the pro-government spirit of the times, Fee's materials provided a rare source of justification. Their various activities from publishing operations to in-person programming to liaising between academic and non-academic spheres, were oriented towards helping neoliberal ideas gain traction in the public sphere. As one of the first of its kind, FEE offered a prototype for what was to become an indispensable instrument of intellectual engineering, in the words of Phil Murawski and Dieter Plewey, within the post-war neoliberal movement, the free market think tank. Whereas subsequent think tanks adopted more policy-oriented frameworks, FEE maintained its broader scope. No example illustrates the inaccuracy of the dominant framework of intellectual production for the history of neoliberalism better than the case of iPencil. In a 1980 episode of his PBS series Free to Choose, economist Milton Friedman recounted this simple and captivating story, in which a commonplace wooden pencil narrates its own history, taking readers on a tour de force of the people and places that had a hand in its making. All along, the pencil urges readers to consider how market processes emerge from associations of free will and spontaneous order. There is no perceivable masterminding involved. I did a close reading of the essay in my thesis, which I actually uploaded the full thesis into the program instead of the abstract. So if you're interested, you can have a look. I describe some of the narrative techniques, including the heavy use of imperative mood, run-on sentences to emphasize complexity. There's language of revelation with words like miracle and wonder. There's establishment of familiarity. So the essay opens with, I am a wooden pencil familiar to all boys and girls. And there's invocation of classical economic ideas, including Smith's invisible hand. This story, sometimes attributed to Milton Friedman, was penned 22 years earlier by Leonard Reed. And Friedman thanks his good friend Reed for the concept. The story continues to enjoy widespread circulation and is often used as a pedagogical tool in economics classrooms, sometimes even graduate classrooms, as one of my professors used iPencil in a lecture a couple weeks ago, which I got it out of. Those are just some modern reactions and repurposes. So I mentioned Friedman's retelling of it in Free to Choose. It was also discussed in an episode of the Freakonomics podcast in 2016, which was fascinating because it brings up some critiques of the story and what the story leaves out, including how government intervention likely helped fund roads and public schools and other things in order for the supply chain to function. So as we can see, Reed had important contributions to the neoliberal movement, which included creating these very simple analogies and rhetoric, which attracted a larger audience. So we have this letter from the editor of the Wall Street Journal who wrote to Reed saying, I'm grateful to you for bringing common sense to a lot of economic questions, which others tend to confuse in a lot of esoteric metaphysics. Reed received a lot of letters like this, including from Murray Rothbard when Murray Rothbard was just a graduate student, later to become a leader in the libertarian movement himself. Okay, and so to conclude, if you could just bear with me, I'm going to read from the screen. So in the introduction to the edited volume on economists as public intellectuals, Tiago Mata and Steve Medema, who's here today, take a broad definition of intellectual to include any agent that has the capacity to make a social intervention. If this were the sole regard through which intellectualism were judged, Leonard Reed would likely cease to be treated as a second-hand character in neoliberalism's history. Whether it be traveling across the country to deliver a speech on liberty to 1,700 medical professionals, organizing intimate dinner conversations between academics and journalists at the New York Waldorf Astoria, soliciting donations from conservative foundations to sponsor free market economic research, or writing playful stories about quotidian material objects, Leonard Reed was constantly engaged in interventions. Reed and Fee sought to create alignment between the spheres they traversed through a variety of mechanisms. They employed rhetorical devices that created the appearance of invitational spaces for deliberation. They marshaled financial resources and built an attractive network that seemed appealing to engage with. And they combined neoliberal ideas with other ideas, moral, spiritual, political, that were gaining purchase in the American post-war intellectual scene, most notably anti-communist ideas in the Cold War. Furthermore, they frame their organization as being a voluntary educational institution promoting sound economic research, helping define in the public imagination what the virtues of economics were. They were doing all of this, importantly, at a time when the mainstream of the discipline was furthering itself from the general public and establishing a self-image as dispassionate, rigorous, and highly professionalized experts. This buffet of social interventions aimed at developing a public appeal for neoliberal ideas is undeserving of a marginal treatment. It is more appropriate, as I've argued throughout this paper, to conceive of Leonard Reed and his organization as a knowledge broker. And so to conclude, I put Reed in the center of his own neoliberal network. This is a modified diagram of Forget's knowledge brokering diagram. In the first slide, what is appealing about a knowledge brokering framework is that it resists the secondhand perception of agents by demonstrating their diverse alliances. Knowledge brokers are not the understudies of accomplished scholars, nor are they simply funders in search of promising enterprises for their vast financial resources. In studying the dynamics between intellectual change, political development, patronage, and popular culture, dynamics that have been oft associated with the rise of neoliberalism, it is important to identify those characters directly involved in building the linkages. Understanding the work of knowledge brokers challenges our assumptions about how knowledge formation takes place. We spend a good deal of time contemplating whether economics does or does not trickle down. We might benefit from contemplating whether ideas do the same. My references, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ibanca. Questions and comments? Again, you can raise your hand and open the mic. Maxime, do you want to?
No, it's just an aside because I love the iPencil story, and I just heard it on a podcast a few days ago, again in the UK context, discussion of problems in supply chain. The business journalist was saying that, you know, this illustrated how governments could not control supply chains, and that yeah, that's it. It's still ongoing use.
Thank you.
It's fascinating. Thanks for flagging that. Did he mention that it was written by Reed or no?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Apparently, he's writing a book on supply chains, and so I guess he did some research. But otherwise, I thought your talk was really interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Nicola.
Yes. Hi all. Thank you, Ibanca. Very nice presentation. Just a very simple question. Do you think there is anything specifically American in this kind of knowledge brokering? Because I can think of similar examples, but they're all Americans. Yes, I saw that Steve has immediately raised his hand. Hi, Steve. But anyway, what do you think about this? I mean.
Thank you for that question. I think there are things that are definitely specifically American about Reed's experience. However, I want to emphasize that he became a model for similar institutions in other countries. So Anthony Fisher was a close friend of Reed. I might get all the acronyms wrong, but he, reproduced the model in the UK. There was another person who reproduced the model, and I believe it was Argentina. I can't remember the name of the person, but he was also associated with Reed. So, I mean, this is definitely a model and an infrastructure that can be taken in a variety of contexts. It doesn't have to be American. I think there were certain issues that FEE capitalized on that were unique to American political culture, especially the role of labor movements and unions was a hot topic at that time, and FEE really interjected in that conversation in the 50s and 60s, as well as obviously the Cold War experience and the role of America as being sort of this bastion for democracy and for capitalism. And so I do think there are things in the American scene that made FEE's rise possible. There was also the libertarian movement was growing at this time as well, which Reed was a part of. So yes, I don't think it's exclusively American as a model. I think at the same time, Fee's experience definitely had elements that were targeted towards the American audience.
Okay, Steve?
Yeah, two things. One, this makes me think of an essay by David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, that I read last night. I think it is in the Atlantic, a new issue or on the website, whatever, of the Atlantic, that bears on the. It's about the history, the history of conservatism, really, going back, to the French, and so French versions, British versions, then what was distinctly American, and then how in his mind it all went down the tubes in the last 4 years, basically. But I think that as regards this conversation about what's uniquely American about that, you might find Brooks's essay interesting, because listening to you talk made me think, yeah, this is sort of something that could only happen in America for various reasons. And I might be wrong on that, but as you say, it really is. But it's not just that Fee's American; it's that this iPencil story is a quintessentially American story in some ways, as I look at it, at least as a dude who's lived 59 years in America with occasional Gulf trips to Europe. The other thing is very different, and that is, this is a simple story, a simple narrative, if we want to go down the Mary Morgan narrative road, that was incredibly attractive. And it would be interesting to me to see somebody, not me, try and put together a paper on simple economic narratives like this. And I wonder if any of them, or how many of them actually came from economists. They could have come from other sources that proved to be so powerfully attractive in such a broad vein. Hayek's Road to Serfdom, but that's not a simple little story, right? It's sort of just 300 pages of the government's going to mess thing up kind of story. I'm talking about really catchy little stuff like this that really captured the popular imagination. And I think that if somebody wants to go down that road and look for counterparts to this, that could be a really interesting paper for a journal like Pedro's, for example.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Steve.
I completely agree. When I found out that Mary was working on her narrative agenda, I went to LSE because that's what she was working on. And I was like, I'd love to write a paper on iPencil, because that was the first thing I learned in my economics class in high school. And why was this a narrative that was, used to introduce economists and introduce students to economics in this way? And I think a project like that would be very helpful to identify more examples of simple narratives like this. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I enjoyed the presentation. I have some issues, though. I've heard you present this before, I think at the Winter Institute, and there were some comments I sent you, and some of these issues sort of come to mind that I've raised previously. And one is to put what Reed is doing in more of sort of a network framework, because he's by no means the only knowledge broker going on. I think you mentioned the Volcker Fund, there's Harold Lunau and so on, and there are these summer institutes that they're sponsoring. So they have and I think there's a whole network of these people. Probably somebody's done sort of a network type analysis of these groups. I'm not sure, but I think one suggestion would be put that in more. And one of the issues when you have networks, then that leads to sort of factionalization. And I think that's happened with Fee, where Fee is kind of viewed as really out there, and they have their own views, and the whole Randian dimension and so on. And partly it has to do with intellectual things, but I think there are personality aspects involved as well. Luna really went off the deep end at the end in terms of becoming a religious fanatic and so on. And so I think maybe that dimension needs to be brought in. And one of the episodes in all this is this initial encounter early on with Reed and then Milton Friedman and Stigler over the Roofs and Ceilings pamphlet. But then later, eventually they reconciled. So even though Friedman eventually took on the iPencil, initially in the 47 or whatever, there'd been a lot of conflict between Reed and Stigler and Friedman and so on this. And Reed tried to dictate what was done, and then the story that Friedman and Stigler refused to sort of accept it and so on. So I think that element needs to be brought in a bit more, some of this, both the network dimension, but then some of the factionalization. The other aspect of this I just wanted to mention, and this sort of links your paper with the previous one, is the key role of Reed in terms of influencing other funders. And there's this story that one of the key people he influenced was Charles Walgreen. And a lot of this aspect as to how W. Allen Wallace was able to get Walgreen to fund what became Stigler's chair was through influencing, having lunches with Reed. And Walgreen and W. Allen Wallace, as dean of the business school, saw Reed as a way of getting Charles Walgreen's trust. And it's interesting that the current occupant of the Walgreen chair, of course, is Richard Thaler. And I asked Thaler if he ever had any dealings with the Walgreen family. He said no, but looking at Stigler's papers, Stigler would routinely give reports to the Walgreens and Charles Walgreen, whatever, and would have lunches with them and so on. So it's interesting that evolution over time. And in terms of the previous paper, when I asked Thaler about this, Thaler acknowledged that getting the Walgreen chair was very important to him in terms of setting up his own network and sort of having independence to pursue his own research program in behavioral economics. And it's interesting that the name has changed from the Walgreen Chair of American Institutions, and now it's the Walgreen Chair of something that's got behavioral science, I think, in it. But so I think that connection I've always, I found quite interesting. But
yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I have not come across, any sort of visual of this network because there's so many different elements, right? There's a visual of the Mont Pellerian Society and those associates. There's, I think, Doherty's Radicals for Capitalism is probably the most focused on the American libertarian movement. I don't recall there being like a visual network in there, but I think something like that would definitely help this paper. So thank you for that suggestion.
Okay, any other question or comment? And at this point, if you want to make a comment or question to the other papers as well, feel free to do. We have a few minutes left. No? So it was great seeing you all here. It's a pity that we are not together physically, but hopefully soon will be. So enjoy the other sessions of the conference and see you around.
Thank you for chairing, Pedro.
Thank you all.
Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.